To my left is Khosrow, who you had seen do an excellent interpretation for us during the first segment. Khosrow Esfahani is an open source investigator working on all things Iran, from human rights violations and protests to missiles and war crimes. He currently leads research at the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council on human rights and international law violations committed by individuals within and linked to the Islamic Republic. To Khosrow's left is Jess Peak, who you heard from earlier when she introduced this program. She is the director of the International and Comparative Law Program and the assistant director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law, where you currently are. She is an expert on digital investigations, human rights, and international criminal law. She co-founded the University of California Digital Investigations Network in 2021 and teaches courses on human rights and war crimes, digital investigations, and international humanitarian law. Jess was also nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in 2023. Which, fun fact, I had no idea that she was nominated for that because she's so humble and it came out at a dinner one night. So that's just for you. To her left is Shaheen Milani. He is the executive director of the Iran Human Rights Documentation Center. He is and that center has been doing work for 20 years. He did note it in the video, but they've been operational since 2004, and I highly encourage everybody to go to the website and look at some of those reports, which are really informative. He obtained his JD from Howard University School of Law and his LLM from Vermont Law School. He joined IHRDC as a staff attorney in 2012 and is the principal author of several reports at the organization. To Shaheen's left is Alexa Koenig. She is the co-faculty director of the Human Rights Center at the UC Berkeley School of Law and the director of HRC's Investigations Program and research professor of law at Berkeley, where she teaches classes that focus on the intersection of emerging technologies and human rights. She's a lecturer in the investigative reporting program at Berkeley Journalism as well. Alexa has been honored with several awards for her work, including the United Nations Association SF's Global Human Rights Award, UC Berkeley's Mark Bingham Award for Excellence, and the Eleanor Swift Award for Public Service. She directed development of the Berkeley Protocol on digital open source investigations and has conducted trainings on open source investigation methods at organizations around the world. And then last but not least is Nushin Sarkarati. She's the Deputy Director at the Strategic Litigation Project at the Atlantic Council. She advises governments and non-governmental actors on prevention and accountability efforts for atrocity crimes and human rights violations. She previously was a senior staff attorney at the Center for Justice and Accountability, where she represented victims and survivors of mass atrocities and severe human rights abuses in pursuing accountability before U.S. courts and foreign national courts through systems of universal jurisdiction. She also worked as an associate director at Human Rights Watch's International Justice Program, where she worked on campaigns pursuing justice for victims and survivors of serious international crimes. She's worked on country contexts all across the world, but she also happens to be of Iranian origin. So I'm really glad that she is now working on these issues with all of us. Guys, okay. Khosrow, can you set the stage for what was happening in September 2022 and what we were seeing online? We obviously have seen a little bit of the background and the context of what happened, but curious to know how you were taking in all the videos and the photos and what that meant to you.
Early on into the protest, I interviewed this very young man who attended one of the rallies in downtown Tehran. At some point, he tried to rescue a woman from being arrested. He was tackled to the ground by a security officer. Another officer sat on his chest, and after that, it was punch after punch landing on his face. they pulled his phone out of his pocket and hold it in front of his face saying, unlock the phone, unlock the phone. This sentence was repeating again and again because they were looking for the footage of the protests. The same pattern was happening with multiple other protesters that I had interviewed. Also journalists, activists. Their homes were raided and they were looking for these videos. This powerful footage of men and women, young and old, taking to the streets, braving death, prison, torture, name it, and still being there trying to bring change to Iran, and at the same time documenting their own bravery, a nation at the height of its glory. But despite all that, they were posting these videos online. And at the time when you were watching these videos, they hit hard. You see people who are risking everything for freedom, for women's rights, for basic rights that millions upon millions take for granted outside countries like Iran. And at the same time, the regime saw the effect that these videos had. So they tried to arrest them. They tried to stop people who were posting them. When they were arrested, the videos were used against them as evidence. And accounts were being taken down, and videos were being removed. And at the same time, fake videos were being posted by regime disinformation officers. And that's where Iran Digital Archive Coalition comes in. A unified effort for saving this sacrifice.
Shaheen, you've been working in this area of documentation for a long time. A lot of that documentation was maybe testimonial in nature or different to collecting this sort of digital evidence. By the way, can everybody silence their phones? Just, I'm guilty of this as well. Can you tell us a little bit about how documentation efforts have changed in recent years since the time that you've been working on this, and how that increased content on social media showing human rights violations has impacted your work?
Sure. Can you hear me? This works? Okay. Well, just for a second, take a guess at how many people are in this room, right? And then later on, maybe you can count. But those two numbers probably will differ, right? So in a protest, afterwards, when we interview a witness who's been to that protest, they may recollect something. They could recollect that there were many people in the square. Maybe there were 20, maybe there were 50, right? But that's the recollection of a witness that may or may not be close to reality. Having a video or an image of that protest will complement that witness testimony and will help us to provide an accurate description of what transpired. A lot of what we've collected over the years has been descriptive by witnesses. A witness may say that security forces shot at us from close range. Okay, that's a term. This doesn't mean like 5 meters, we don't know whether it's 5 meters, whether it's 10 meters, whether it's 20 meters. All of them could be close range. But when you have a video, you can actually see what the witness is describing, right? And sometimes the video will actually corroborate what the witness is saying, and sometimes the evidence shows something different, right? So memory could be faulty. We've all seen that. We've all seen wrongful convictions in the United States because of false testimony, right? Because your memory can fail you. But nevertheless, like sometimes there's no other way. Like when a person is describing the torture they went through, the things they saw in prison, that's all we can have because it's within prison walls. There's no other source of information. But when it comes to protest, having these videos will really help us to provide a clear picture, and then have that evidence be at a state that it can be presented for potential complaints criminal complaints, in various countries and various jurisdictions. So it is a tremendous help. But again, each portion of the evidence that you have serves a purpose. Witness testimony is very powerful, and still it's the bread and butter of our work. But these videos and other open source information, like statements by government officials, right? Iranian government officials have a tendency to make false narratives about what happened, and they're not really careful about what they say. They say contradictory things about why a person died. One day they may say they died of suicide, and another day they might say that they had a heart attack. When we collect all of these pieces of information, we can both show what actually happened and actually show how the government tried to present a false narrative. And that will help us get a better and more clear picture of the atrocities that we're trying to document.
Nushin, you're a longtime human rights litigator, and you have experience building cases across different country contexts. Did you see a gap here with the groups working on building human rights documentation and trying to build these cases? And what did you and others do to try to solve it?
Well, thanks, Gisu. And first off, Gisu recruited me to her organization and told me, as an Iranian, you need to start using your skills as a human rights lawyer for justice and accountability for these protests. And what Gisu and I quickly identified was that we weren't just witnessing human rights violations, we were seeing the potential of international crimes. And the road to accountability for these types of violations is a very, very long one. Even when there's political will worldwide to see accountability, it still takes a very long time to build these cases. And these videos were being removed from the internet. So we worked with IHRDC and the Promise Institute to create the concept of a central digital archive that would preserve these videos. And other organizations like Azadi Archive were also doing this. But we decided to recruit an organization called Mnemonic, which is well respected in our field for developing these types of archives that forensically preserve social media as evidence. And what I mean by forensically preserve is even if these videos are removed from the internet in the future when accountability is possible and you can't find the original, they've preserved it in such a way that you can prove when it was posted, by whom, so that it could be presented as evidence in a court of law. So we worked with Mnemonic, which had a similar archive on Syria, Ukraine, Sudan, and Yemen that were already being used by investigative authorities around the world. And luckily they agreed to create the Iranian archive. They quickly, with the work of this coalition here, were able to preserve 2 million pieces of data. And we realized that was so much information. We needed to bring on open source investigation experts like at the Human Rights Center at Berkeley, at the Promise Institute, and at Amnesty International to work with groups like IHRDC and Azadi Archive to really start looking and analyzing what we had, start tagging the types of violations we were seeing, so that we weren't just preserving it, we were doing the analysis to be able to share this with investigative authorities. Now with the work we're doing with Mnemonic, we know this information will be there in the future when cases might be possible. What these protesters did will not be lost should accountability happen. And hopefully that happens soon and we can all contribute to that justice effort.
Alexa, I'm going to ask you a two-part question. One is a little bit about the Berkeley Protocol, because it was part of your intro, and it would be great for some folks to know what that is and to look at that. But curious for you to tell us a little bit about how that digital evidence could be used in accountability proceedings, and also just to zoom out a bit on the work of, how there's a global context here. And then the second part of the question is to give just a readout of some highlights of the reports that you've worked on with the coalition and some things that the audience might be interested in knowing about your upcoming reports, one that's published and one that will be published soon.
Thank you. So maybe I'll start with, so 30 years ago, the Human Rights Center at UC Berkeley was established by a longtime war crimes investigator. So he really brought to our center at Berkeley this ethos of the importance and value of investigation. In 2009, we began looking at how the spread of the smartphone and the rise of social media was creating new opportunities for finding facts about the world, including atrocities that had taken place. And we began working on projects like the Rashomon Project to basically take all these videos people were uploading and try to see how we could get multiple perspectives on the killing of a protester or some other mass atrocity by syncing them together and being able to look at that from all different angles. We all know that videos can be very misleading, particularly when they're taken out of context. We were also working with the International Criminal Court. We knew that the court was about to get hit by a tsunami of social media content. At that time, they had not yet had a case where social media had really been up and running. So we knew that that was about to shift. We did a big study on their 10-year anniversary to find out how they were doing in terms of international justice, and the answer was not good. The main thing the judges were saying was a problem was that they were bringing in the stories of survivors without bringing in the corroborating information Shaheen was talking about to basically meet the evidentiary standards needed to allow these cases to proceed. So the Berkeley Protocol is a set of international guidelines that were developed starting around 2016, 2017 to try to maximize the value of this user footage, the protest footage, etc., for court-related purposes. It is a project that we did in partnership with the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. It is truly an international effort. We interviewed more than 150 different people around the world who are really at the cutting edge of digital investigations, whether they were trial attorneys who would need to use that footage in court or investigators who are figuring out how to find, analyze, and archive that data. It was also based on 5 different international workshops that we hosted for very untested areas of practice. This was still a very new phenomenon in the international justice community. Today, basically, it allows people to try to figure out how do we do this work as ethically, as efficient, and effectively as we possibly can. And we're now trying to train different war crimes investigation teams and other civil society groups around the world in those basic principles so that we can begin to make sure that the footage that people take such risks to capture is actually of value by the time it makes it to court. So in terms of the reports, really quickly, we have been working on a series of reports as a component of this coalition. I need to shout out all of the Berkeley authors who are here because this is truly the fruits of their labor. I'm here to support them as they support the coalition, supporting the incredible people who are really fighting to bring greater attention to what's happening in Iran. The first is looking at the blinding of protesters. So one of the, some of the issues that we've seen there is that we pulled together from the data set collected by Mnemonic and also from UCLA under Jess Peak, 124 discrete incidents where protesters were blinded. And a few big things that we noticed from that data set. First, the majority of the people who were blinded, at least in this set, were under the age of 30. Now, there might be a bias because it might be younger populations who are actually posting about their experiences to social media, but we think it's a phenomenon worth investigating further. A second was the kinds of weapons that were being used to blind these individuals. Some of the most common were to use pellet guns, but also to use paintball guns, and we actually consulted with an expert to see if we were misunderstanding that phenomenon. But no, these are commonly now being used at protest sites. A third was the potential intentionality of these blindings, that they were not one-off or accidental. There are several people within the data set who either made comments like, this person smiled at me before they shot me in the eyes, or they were at very close range. Another finding was that it was not just the protesters, but bystanders who were potentially being targeted. So we have anecdotes of a little girl who was standing on a balcony when she was shot and blinded, as well as others who were not engaged in the protests themselves. So it seems to be a discouragement of people supporting these protests or even paying attention. I'll leave it at that for the sake of time, but I'll move on maybe to one other report that I think is important to spotlight. And this is a report that Koshiro is working on with my colleague Andrea Richardson on gender persecution. Gender persecution as an international crime against humanity is a radically under-prosecuted crime. And it's one that I think as an international justice effort, we are really trying to see greater accountability for. Unfortunately, I think a lot of these videos that have been collected provide rich sources of material to suggest that gender persecution is happening. We took international guidelines for investigators and have tried to map those videos and do the open source investigation and verification work to really show through a series of incidents just what a phenomenon this is and how we do think there is the potential to bring cases at some downstream point. The last thing I'll mention is just another thing that stands out from that work is the importance of acknowledging the intersectionality of how people have been targeted for their gender, but also for ethnicity, for their class, etc. And really recognizing the full nature of these harms, I think, is a really important social contribution. Thank you.
Thank you. Before we go to Jess, because we touched on the gender persecution report, I want to turn to Khosrow to talk us through maybe what was some of the more interesting findings in that work and your work on verifying these open source incidents that go to prove this up.
So through the process of working on this report, one of the things that we tried to demonstrate was that you don't need in-country access to show that the Islamic Republic is committing crimes against humanity. One of the cases that we worked on, there is 3 separate videos of an 18-year-old being shot dead by security forces. From the moment that they point the gun to the moment that his body is taken away, all of that is recorded and all of that is public information. And there has been zero accountability inside Iran over this extrajudicial killing. And this is not an isolated case. We have seen case after case of people being sexually assaulted on the street by security forces. We have seen the state openly, the supreme leader coming out and saying that the protest is a festering wound that should be burned, and after that people getting arrested and sentenced to death. We have seen all these patterns, and at the same time, whenever families have tried to fight for accountability, they have faced pressure, isolation, jail. We heard from Afsun today about the persecution that her family faced after their loved one was killed. The same is happening to Mashallah Karami, father of a young protester who was arrested, charged under bogus charges, sentenced to death, and hanged by the Islamic Republic. And this mourning father is right now in jail in Iran. He has been in jail for over a year. His crime? Talking about his son, not even asking for anything, just being a voice, holding dear the memory of a child he lost. They have raided his homes, they have destroyed any memorial he had, any valued memory, every piece of clothing of this dear child to him, and then they have taken him to court. They have sentenced him to jail because he was distributing food among the poor in memory of his son. This pattern of impunity has been repeated in case after case that we studied, of brave people who are being just punished for existing, for living, for demanding a fair society, more freedom.
And on that note, Khosrow, really important point that we of course heard Afsun discuss and that you've just mentioned now is this pattern of family intimidation. On that note, Jess, can you talk to the audience about the work and the report that the Promise Institute has done on this and some of the trends that you found in that work?
Absolutely. And maybe I'll start with just a little bit on how we had students involved in this work, because that's been such an important component of the work of this coalition over the past year and a half. So I was approached by Gisu and Nushin in the spring of 2023 to come on board to help build out this digital archive. And my team of students was kind of the first line of defense in the collection of information. We were then subsequently joined by many other organizations, both in partnership with this coalition and other partners that Mnemonic has been working with. And even in those very early weeks, the first couple of months of the data collection, we were seeing some very notable trends. Alexa just mentioned blinding and gender persecution. But a third that we saw and that my team really decided to focus in on our report was the enforced disappearance, arbitrary killing of children. In the initial data set, we identified about 134 children who had been killed during the protest movement in various ways. And we undertook an investigation into those children. Ultimately, we found a lot of data, and we will be publishing a report next week on 12 of those case studies. And what these case studies document is either the enforced disappearance, by which I mean a child is disappeared from the streets with the involvement of government officials, and then there is denial by the regime, and or the arbitrary killing of those children, and which is quickly followed by rampant information suppression by the regime. And we've heard about this from Shaheen already, and of course, Afshun was telling us about what her family experienced in the aftermath of the killing of her younger sister. And really what we were seeing and how this information suppression manifests with the Islamic Republic is that the regime wants to tell a particular narrative of what happened that usually does not align with what actually happened, right? And so what we're seeing again and again the regime is pushing a narrative of, oh, this young person had a heart attack. This young person committed suicide. And what is being reported by family members and loved ones of those people is absolutely the opposite. It is the involvement of security forces in their deaths and in their disappearances. And so what our report does is really show, using the example specifically of children killed during the first 2 months of the protests, how the Islamic regime then acts towards their family and the survivors of those loved ones. And what is happening is the regime is coming into their homes, it is following them on the streets, it is preventing family members from mourning the loss of their loved ones. They, in some instances, are not allowing family members to claim the bodies of their loved ones unless they sign false statements attesting to the narrative that the regime wants to put forward. They are preventing those family members from burying their loved ones. They are intimidating them. If they are allowed to bury them, they, as we heard from Afshun and her cousins, are sometimes arresting people at the grave sites. And they're really doing all of this to try and create a narrative that deflects blame from the regime in all of these cases. And so what we've been able to do through the report is really carefully document 12 particular instances of this happening across the country, as well as provide some information on a collection of cases that have happened in minority communities, for which there is not so much information. And maybe Khosrow, I'll ask you to talk a little bit about why there's less information available in some regions than others. But that is what our report shows. Just to say a word about how the students did this work. They did an amazing job. This is really, really difficult content to look at. They needed to really establish such a deep contextual understanding of the situation in Iran, which they did with the help and partnership of everybody you see up here and many others in the room and in the broader coalition. They had to learn how to research in a foreign language, in Persian, using translation tools. That is not easy. It is very challenging. And they had to figure out where this relevant content was going to be. So they had to do research into what platforms were in use, whether there were prominent social media accounts that were posting relevant content that they would need to look at. And they really needed to collect and help Mnemonic archive this data. Alongside all of that, they were telling us, we're seeing this trend, we're seeing that trend. And that really prompted all of us sitting here to think about how we were going to organize and categorize this data. And so it really was the students doing the practical work of gathering the information that has been bravely shared by the people of Iran that have led us to where we are today. And so I'm so thankful to those of them that are in the room from the Promise Institute and also from the Berkeley team and also from many schools around the world that have been engaged in this effort.
Before we move to Shaheen, Khosrow, I don't know if you want to just color in a little bit of what Jess was alluding to.
So when it comes to ethnic minorities, specifically the Kurdish and Baluch ethnic minorities, we see a pattern. Sorry, thank you. We see a pattern that the amount of open source evidence of the violence that they were facing is significantly lower compared to what we were getting out of major cities like Tehran, like Shiraz, like Isfahan. Uh, the level of evidence that we were seeing, the violence is higher. The issue, I will separately talk about the two ethnic minorities. In case of the Baluch people, they live in southeast Iran. They are literally the poorest part of the Iranian society. We are talking about millions of people who don't even have access to drinking water. We are speaking of this context. Every year, children, when they are trying to pull water from small rivers and ponds, they fall in them and die. That's the level of poverty that we are talking about. Imagine what would be the wide technology gap that exists in this context. That's one. They are poor. They don't have access to technology. And when they do, it's exclusively almost access to mobile internet. Yes, they have smartphones because everyone now can afford, to some extent, a Chinese smartphone, which is kind of cheaper. But in the case of the Baluchi people, they mostly rely, almost over 90%, rely on mobile internet for accessing the World Wide Web. And in response, the Islamic Republic, as mentioned in this panel, has been constantly evolving its response to the protests. In case of the Baluchi people, when there are protests, they shut down mobile internet and keep landline internet on. What does that mean? When you look from outside, you see that there is current of internet. You wouldn't say that there is an internet shutdown, while 90% of the population doesn't have access to internet. A semi-total internet shutdown being imposed. That's one side of it. The other element is that in both these regions that are populated by Baluch and Kurdish ethnic minorities, the response to protests were extreme militarization of the areas. For instance, we were talking with Shaheen earlier about the Bloody Friday of Zahedan. In a single day, almost 100 people were killed with military weaponry. In other cities, there were killings, but in no case we have such high fatality rate in a single day. They went to a mosque and started shooting at people. One of the victims on that day was a small girl. She was at the mosque with her grandmother, and they started shooting tear gas into the mosque. One of the canisters hit this young girl in the head. She passes out and then suffocates because of the tear gas. This is the level of violence we are seeing in that region. And then in other regions, yes, there is killing, there is shooting, but there is a gap between the regime switching to military-grade weaponry. They start with paintball guns, with pelts, with batons. But in case of Baluchistan, the immediate weapon that they start using is AK-47s and dushkas. Dushkas are these machine guns that you cannot carry. A person cannot carry this weapon. It should be transferred with a pickup truck. These are the type of weaponry that is used there. In case of the Kurdish area, it was an almost military rule in that area. When you talk with people from the region during the protests, they were telling you that we cannot record videos on the streets. Immediately when they took their phones out of their pockets, they were arrested. So this is the level of violence that we see in these two regions, and therefore less evidence exists open source.
Looking at this, the in-depth trends in some of these provinces on this point, I know that Shaheen, Iran Human Rights Documentation Center, just published a report on the suppression of the woman life freedom movement in Gilan and Mazandaran provinces, which is in the north of Iran. And the report was based on open source and closed source information. Can you just share some of the key findings with this group?
Sure. Just as backdrop, first when the Women Life Freedom Movement began, shortly after, on September 30th, 2022, we had the Bloody Friday of Zahedan, in which 100 people were killed. So obviously, we had to write something about it. and that's why focus on one place, because we cannot focus on the whole country. We're a small organization. So first we wrote a report on that, on Zahedan on that day. Then we became to Western Iran. We wrote a report about the Kurdish regions. Of course, that's where Mahsa Amini was from. And then just observing the data and the number of protests that had taken place, we sensed that it would be suitable to look at what happened in northern Iran, in particularly Mazandaran province and Gilan province. We found that 57 people were killed during the protest there within a 1-year period. Most were shot by bullets. Several were killed in Lakan prison. There was a riot in there, and then we don't know what exactly happened. But several people died in that prison, and no investigation has been brought to discuss and explain what happened there. But the broad pattern of what happened in Gilan and Mazandaran provinces, it basically fits the same pattern that happened in other parts of the country. You have security forces shooting at people, killing them, and then trying to basically shift the blame to whoever they want, especially to Zed Enqilab, right? The anti-revolutionaries, whoever that they might be. And we've seen evidence of the government pressuring families to basically even come on television, on camera, and provide a false narrative about what happened to their loved ones. We have government pressuring families to state that their loved ones are shaheeds, martyrs, and then receive a monetary sum as compensation, and then that's the end of the story. Just absolving the government of any responsibility. So we have that misinformation that we talked about, and it's just very tragic, and it just shows the depth of the movement. In the video that was just played before we came on, I'm sure many of you have seen the video. There's a video of this girl who's dancing, and then she throws her scarf in a bonfire. That's in Sari, that's in Mazandaran province, the capital of the province. So this movement, it was all across the country, and we need to keep that in mind. More than 400 people were killed. The way our media operates, we tend to know only a few of the victims, because their stories somehow are more appealing, and we hear more of their stories. That's the nature of how media works. But we need to keep that in mind. As human rights organizations, we have to treat everybody equally, right? Unfortunately, of the 100 people who were killed in Zahedan that day, we don't know their names. I mean, in our report, we've listed their names, but even I cannot recall their names. But that this work has to be done. Everybody's life is valuable. Some may get more publicity than others, but anyway, we have to keep that in mind, that it's a nationwide movement and all these people have been killed.
Such an important point, Shaheen. Nushin, just to close out this portion before we get to Q&A, if anybody has any questions, what's your hope for Mnemonic's continued work on Iranian archive and preserving this information, and the work of this coalition in these investigations? How do you think it can help further accountability on Iran?
Thanks, Gisu. What I said earlier is that justice for these types of violations that the panel has shared today is quite a ways off. What's clear is that we cannot have accountability inside Iran. victims' families who even dare talk about what happened to them face a severe repression. So imagine trying to pursue justice in a court of law in a climate like that. It's impossible. So accountability would only be possible if there's been a transition in government in the future, which may not happen. But the other option is through foreign states. So many countries have systems of universal jurisdiction. These are laws that allow them to prosecute serious violations of international law that didn't take place on their soil and aren't even linked to nationals of that state. We see a lot of these types of cases proceeding right now against Syrian officials, for example, in countries such as Germany and France and elsewhere. We've targeted these countries, including Canada, where Islamic Republic officials could potentially travel, and have asked them to open investigations that are called structural investigations, which are broad-based investigations to identify the types of violations that we've been discussing today and to identify potential perpetrators of these violations. Our presentation to these war crimes offices has said that they can use the mnemonic Iranian archive as a tool, that we've forensically preserved this data that could assist them in these investigations. Luckily, also, the UN set up a fact-finding mission on Iran, and you will hear from the chair of that fact-finding mission later, which has identified international crimes and has called on these foreign states to take actions against the individual perpetrators of these crimes, but also against the state itself by bringing cases before the International Court of Justice for the violations that took place. This is where we can see a possibility of accountability in the future, and it really does take a push from civil society, from international organizations such as those present here, and the UN and its fact-finding mission to really push and engage countries to take this issue up, because we know that Iran will continue to commit these violations if there is no justice for these crimes.
Before we move to questions, I just want to say one thing to make it clear to everybody. You're hearing, from everyone up here about how much danger people are putting themselves in doing this work and doing this documentation from inside Iran. And I just want to underscore how carefully we thought about that when we were identifying individuals in our reports. So we put so much care and thought and research and consideration into what names and what images we would publish of these individuals. And we really decided to only publish the names of those who were already very well known, either within or outside of the country. None of us here, with perhaps the exception of IHRDC, have had any opportunity to interview anybody directly. So this really is all open source work. And I just want to make it very clear that the people named in these reports are there because we made a determination based on very careful research and consideration to include them, because they are already public figures speaking out about what happened to them and their loved ones.
We have a lot of questions. Some of them are the same, along the same lines of the same questions, so I'll try to summarize a bit of that. We have about 10 minutes for questions, and then we're going to go to a break with pastries, coffee. Hope that everybody stays awake. And then we'll hear from Elahe Tavakolian, a brave protester who's here with us today to talk about her experience. And then we'll hear from Sarah Hussein in conversation with actor and activist Nazanin Boniadi. So the first question, easy question, but one that folks need to know: are the videos and visual archives available for researchers and academics to conduct their research? And if so, what is the process to access these documents? Who wants to take that?
Yeah, you can either contact our coalition and we could discuss providing access to some of the information. Azadi Archive has already been working with academics and researchers to help them identify video. The Mnemonic Archive is meant for assisting in legal accountability, but there are instances where it can support human rights fact-finding and investigation. But for the reasons Gisu and Jess have said earlier, we can't make this publicly searchable central database of victims, as it could be used as a tool of repression. So that's why we have to keep some of this information, only accessible upon request.
And I started with a softball question, but this one is a meaty one, and we'll try to keep the answer short-ish. How do you see the emergence and advancement of AI technology as an advantage or disadvantage in archiving, utilizing the videos you are collecting? I know we will not answer that in full here, but maybe to give a preview of the things that we're thinking about.
I'm happy to jump in on that one. I think one of the challenges we have is, as you've heard, Mnemonic has gathered already more than 2 million pieces of content related to just Iran and these protests. So unfortunately, that scale becomes so outside of human scale using a lot of the methodologies that investigators are currently using, for example, scraping X/Twitter or other platforms, that I do think AI is going to become an invaluable partner to human review of a lot of this content. Now, we all know that AI is fallible. It does often a very bad job of taking into consideration context and nuance. But I do think we're going to need AI to equip us in terms of scaling down some of these and doing rough cuts. So if we're looking for the blinding of protesters, using it to try to identify individuals whose faces may have blood on them as just a first pass that can then be subject to human review. But also too, I would really push, and this is a principle in the Berkeley Protocol, the concept of data minimization is an important principle for a reason. As lawyers, when you scrape large data sets and you don't even know what you have in that data set, if you are a prosecution team, you have obligations of disclosure to the defense for any exonerating information. And I think that's been a concern of ours in working with international tribunals, of just the huge quantities of data that are being collected without the ability for appropriate review. So I do see kind of a human machine partnership in the future.
Does anybody have any other burning thoughts that they want to share? This could be books and books written about this, but it's a thoughtful and important question, and a few people asked it. This is also a very thoughtful question. How can victims, persons who've been affected, still drive the direction of reports when these reports are entirely based on open source information? Is there concern that victims lose their ability to direct strategy in such cases?
You started with the softball for okay.
I mean, this information is
Yes.
it's complementary and things like that, but
the issue is when you work in spaces like this, you gradually start to learn how to read people. You go through a sea of pain and suffering and try to absorb every drop of it, and then squeeze your heart out on paper to deliver a report. That's how journalism has worked for generations. Yes, when someone has suffered this type of pain, their narrative, as Shaheen was mentioning, it can be colored by that pain as well. That's why we seek open source information. That's why we seek any shred of evidence that would corroborate their testimonies, and then we compare what we are receiving as a testimony with the general pattern of how the Islamic Republic has operated over the past 4 decades. The 2022 protest wasn't the first time that this was happening in Iran. We have had round after round of crimes against humanity being committed by the Islamic Republic, from mass executions in 1980s to student protests of 80s to the 2009 Green Movement, and then fast forward to 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, 2021 protests. Every year, almost, we had a cycle of protests. And every cycle, we have observed these patterns. What was happening on the ground in the jail, we just don't limit ourselves to a single case. When we are hearing about a pattern of, for instance, sexual abuse as a form of torture, we go review dozens of cases that fall in the same category. And yeah.
I can actually add to that. When we write a report, we don't base it on just one witness's testimony, right? We interview several people, like 5, 10, the more the better. And we can establish a pattern of what is happening. So after interviewing, number of people, we can understand that, okay, maybe the pattern of torture in Kurdistan province is harsher than torture in Tehran, right? So you draw conclusions based on interviews that you've conducted with a number of witnesses. open source media complements that. So we never write reports and come to conclusions based on like one person's testimony, but rather a collection of testimony from various witnesses. So in that sense, yes, we still need witnesses, we still need people to tell their stories, and after we've gathered all of that, then we can draw and infer reasonable conclusions.
I would just add to that I think working in coalitions like this one is incredibly important. That is how we ensure that different voices are heard, and members of this coalition are very closely working in coordination with groups of survivors and impacted community members on the ground, and that is one of the ways in which we can ensure that the work that we're doing is responsive to the needs of those impacted communities.
We only have time for 2 more questions. Fortunately, a lot of the questions are similar, so I'm going to ask these last 2 that I think are really important. One is, do we have any example of a country where this kind of documentation helped bring the people who committed atrocities to justice?
Yeah, a few. I think Syria is an incredible example. I think that the digital open source investigations community owes a huge debt of gratitude to both Iran and Syria, which I think unfortunately had crises within their countries that really paralleled the evolution of a lot of these digital technologies that help investigators thousands of miles away understand the who did what to whom, when, where, and how. And I think we've become more sophisticated as a community of verifying that information to hopefully amplify and support what survivors have said taken place. But we also, of course, have examples right here in the United States. If you look at the events of January 6th in the last election, where over, I think, 700 cases were filed in just those first few months alone. A lot of the information that came in to support those later cases and prosecutions came from postings that people made themselves to social media, and then also others had posted about the activities that day. The last one I might mention is a very iconic, I shouldn't say iconic, but a very important case, I think, in the evolution of the use of these technologies would be the al-Rafali case at the International Criminal Court. Al-Rafali was a leader in the Al-Saika Brigade who was accused of the extrajudicial killing of more than 30 people. And his case was the first time that an international arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court was ever issued on the basis of social media, almost predominantly on the basis of social media content. So a series of videos that were posted to Facebook, also supported by a UN report that would also be considered public-facing information, so open source. And it really, I think, was an international expression of the extraordinary power that this kind of content can have.
And then the last few questions, I'll summarize it this way. What is the action that people in this room can take, that our communities can take, that people in the Iranian diaspora can take to support this work, if anything?
Well, first off, I think calling on states to actually take up the charge to open up investigations related to the violations that we've been describing today. These states don't need to work alone. The fact-finding mission on Iran has already identified the international crimes that many states have jurisdiction over to open investigations on. A lot of these cases, though, do require political will. War crimes offices have a lot of discretion on what international cases to investigate. So our team, other organizations, and I think individuals really should be calling on states, especially states like Germany and France and Canada, that have the power to open these investigations and could be places where perpetrators may travel and also host a lot of the victims who have fresh information of the violations that they've experienced. That information should be collected and preserved in these states by the opening of these investigations. So I think calling on representatives to open up investigations to ensure that we're not seeing a repeat of these actions in the future. I also encourage you all to read some of these reports, educate yourselves on these violations, and also try to get through the fact-finding mission's 500-page report if you can to learn more. But it includes a lot of calls to action around responsibility that really do require states to take action, and we need to ensure that these states are actually taking those steps for accountability.
And for the students in the room, get involved. Come and talk to me, come and talk to Alexa. There are lots of opportunities to do this work on Iran right now through our teams. We need you and we want you, and we really would love for you to be able to put the content that you're learning in the classroom into practice through these investigations. So please do get involved with us.
One last thing also I want to add. Today we were joined by Afsun, and we are going to later hear from Elahe Tawakkolian. One of them lost a sister, the other has lost an eye in the fight for freedom. Be humbled before them. These are people who have risked everything, who have paid the blood price, and they are still talking. They are still fighting. Checking the news is a horrible habit. It's annoying. It's constantly terrible news coming in. But imagine being in their shoes. Imagine losing a loved one, losing a part of your body, and they are still continuing the fight. Play your share.
Thank you, Khosrow, for closing us out on that very important reminder to us all.